Hello and welcome to Transform's Strategic Sequencing CPD session. Today we're going to be exploring, do we really understand cognitive load theory? I've been doing quite a bit of research and communicating with quite a few school leaders, and I think one of the prominent messages that we're hearing from the new Ofsted framework is how invested our Ofsted are in the impact part of their investigation. They seem to be more data driven and they seem to be more focused on that kind of evidential proof, which perhaps didn't have to be quite so prominent before. So I suppose one of the reasons why we have this slide is just so we can really articulate why does this specific topic matter for school leaders. And at the outcome of this, one of the things that I'm going to share with you is a tool which I've made and used previously that really underpins my sequencing. And you'll see it's molded for computing, but actually it's transferable to any curriculum. And you can use AI to do that and to make that transformation. But what it does do is that when you're questioned as to why the sequence is the way it is, you can articulate in a very significant way why you do what you do, and you've got the data that's more important to prove it. I think a lot of the curriculums out there, the computing curriculum being one of them, says we do what we do and the sequence is what the way it is because of a spiral curriculum. But actually that spiral curriculum can mean that you're just having common themes. There's a thematic element there which is expanded on year by year, and that's fine, but what it doesn't necessarily mean is that that sequence across the year is formulated in the best way. And there needs to be a lot of investigation when inquiring why that sequence exists. And I suppose that's what this Excel spreadsheet, which we'll explore today, can really help expand our reflection in seeing is the journey which the student has at the moment, is that the best one? And if it isn't, making amendments to it. So misconceptions can often arise from students if sequencing isn't managed carefully. It can create shallow understandings and it can create gaps which can have to be, teachers will have to go through and address those misconceptions and those gaps. But actually, if you've got the sequencing right in the first place, those gaps can be diminished and those misconceptions can be overcome very early on. So in actual fact, better sequencing enables those gaps to be overcome and therefore reduces workload, especially for the teachers. But this spreadsheet can also go further. For SLT, it can create a bigger picture. And often when I've been trying to talk to teachers about their sequencing, they seem to be experts and know their sequencing, and that's great, and they do. But I don't. I don't have that full picture. And actually, when Ofsted comes and speaks to me, it's really helpful for me to have that thorough understanding as to why it's sequenced in that specific way. And actually, throughout the year, I can use this as a metric to help them understand and to myself to understand what's the journey the students are going. So I suppose it enables teachers to also articulate and for me to be on the same page as those teachers by using, by using programs and spreadsheets such as this. So let's move on to cognitive load theory. Now, Ofsted has been citing cognitive load theory quite a bit, and they articulate that cognitive load theory underpins this new Ofsted transformation and this new framework which we've got. So I think it's only fair and beneficial to understand really what cognitive load theory is and how it relates to sequencing. So previously, cognitive load theory has always been present in Ofsted, but the way that they measured it before was to look at student workbooks, and that would help demonstrate and showcase where sequencing created high load because misconceptions would drive up And you could often see across the board, especially by speaking to students with that pupil voice, and observations can play a small part in that. But what you would find definitely through workbooks is where that strain was. However, it doesn't take into account different factors, and this is where head teachers often kind of tore their hair out really with Ofsted, because fine, in some way it shows cognitive strain theory and cognitive overload, but in other ways it might just be socioeconomic factors. It might be actually that student had something going on that specific day. It wasn't clear cut in terms of the evidence that this was in fact the journey. It became a perspective that Ofsted that this journey was taking place, but there wasn't substantial backing or evidence, and it was kind of the schools to create that evidence and that narrative. And I suppose what this spreadsheet does is it allows that narrative to be formed straight away. So Ofsted has that clear knowledge and that clear view as to why sequencing takes place, and therefore they have to investigate less. And what they do investigate has already been crafted and signposted by you. So to some degree, you've got more control over that as well. So CLT shows us that actually retention for students is extremely small. And good sequencing spaces out concepts, and that's really important to transfer knowledge from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. So there are different forms of cognitive load, and we'll go through that shortly, but in effect, that's the journey. How can we make sure that our sequencing doesn't stress students out and make sure that any knowledge that's given to them is done in a careful and considered way, and then that transformation happens from short-term to long-term. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I think it's important to break down and make distinctions between aspects of the cognitive load theory, because by making those distinctions, we can measure them independently, as you'll see. So first of all, let's go with cognitive demand just in general. So this is what pupils must think about. What does the curriculum expect them to know? Now, schools for years have tried to make this slightly measurable by creating I can statements, and that's actually, I think, a positive step. But what do you do with those I can statements? That's the question. Many, many years ago, I was working at a school where they had all these I can statements, and students used to laboriously tick them off. And what I tried to argue was actually, by doing this, it becomes qualitative and not quantitative. And what you want is for your data to be as quantitative as possible in this instance, because then it allows metrics to be created and it allows you to analyze data. So, for example, to put that into plain text, a head teacher couldn't sit with all these I can statements and then say 70% of our students have actually met these I can statements, 30% haven't. Because it's on a piece of paper, and unless you're going to do a content analysis and go through every student's workbook, you haven't got that data to be measured. So the I can statements, great idea, but the back end of it, what you're doing with those I can statements makes them redundant. So what we need to do, and what the spreadsheet does, is build on that. So the next thing to consider is conceptual load. So this is how complex the lesson is. So one of the things which I've done in order to try to make this, and keeping in mind no system is perfect, but what I've tried to do is to make something abstract into something that can be conceptualized. So we've gone through all the I can statements, and what we've done is we've rated them into a Bloom's category, because that's what comes direct from the specification anyway. But by linking it directly and clearly to that Bloom's, we can articulate and say this is how difficult it is, because as we know, obviously, to create is much more complicated than to explain or to describe. So that's where the conceptual load comes from. In that specification, what are we being asked to do? So whilst it's important to measure these things separately, it's also really helpful to have a combined measurement. So the two total together creates and is measured by something called a strain index. The higher the strain, the more intervention that needs to be required, and the more carefully you need to consider the sequencing. So high demand equals high load. Lessons pupils cannot access securely, no matter how well they're taught. we need to carefully look at what those lessons are and make sure that they're planned very carefully. So what this enables is, from a senior leadership position, a whole sheet basically where you can say for every subject, these are the modules that have high strain, and therefore collaboratively as a department or as a school we can sit down and map out what are we doing. So for example, if we know that this subject is being taught here in computing, which is high strain, and we also know that in maths this is also high strain, because the fields are quite relatable, perhaps that's not the best approach for sequencing. It might be better to have that in the previous term where that load will be less of a demand. Now all of this may sound arduous, it might sound, good heavens, yes, sounds very idyllic, but actually it's a lot of work. It isn't, I assure you. The spreadsheet which I've made auto-calculates itself. It's got some heavy coding in it. And all you've got to do is just look at the spreadsheet, tell me what your I-CAN statements are, and again, AI can generate that. Just give it this spec and say, tell me what all the I-CAN statements are. Copy and paste it in, and it does it all for you. And all you've got to do then is read what the string theory is, which lessons, which modules, and then sequence them in a way which works for you. So it does all the heavy lifting for you. It just requires that little bit of input, and again, mostly from AI. But what it does do is create that strategic oversight into sequencing, which really is arduous when you don't use something like this. I've already mooted this at the beginning, but this is just to probably add a little bit of credence from Ofsted's own words as to why this approach perhaps should be highly considered. So we already know we've got the new framework, and I quote, in order to get excellent, it emphasises coherence of sequencing and leadership's understanding of the curriculum quality. So for me, this adds a bit of a different dynamic where it's not just up to curriculum leaders now to articulate that sequence in a micro way, but school leaders also have to do the same thing, but on a macro level. And I think, considering Ofsted as well are looking, from what we've heard, about more data heavy, and just to kind of really emphasize that. So there was a head teachers conference in kind of North Staffordshire, and one of the head teachers had recently had their experience of Ofsted very in the early days, and it said actually it was quite refreshing because they came at this from different perspectives, but they were not just working on their own assumptions anymore. They were looking at data to support those judgments in a way where previously they'd been more than happy to overlook. But what he did say as a consequence is I needed my data to be more robust. I needed me to it required me to know my school in a very micro level way. But it was also quite, I think he said the word, he came out perspirating, which I know head teachers do from Ofsted in general, but this was kind of like, he said, a lot more stressful than before. Not bad stressful, but good stressful. As long as you are organised and you know what your curriculum does, he said it was actually quite rewarding as well to say what we're doing works, and it does work. He said it probably, there's a lot of schools which are good at the moment who think they're going into the new Ofsted hoping they're still going to maintain that degree of positivity. But actually, he said, I think it's going to be harder for them. Don't go into the Ofsted thinking, well, actually, they're going to be looking at it the same way. That impact is so profound now from Ofsted. They really are looking, from what I've been told, and from what people are discussing with me and all the networking, they're saying it's much more impact heavy. It's okay to say, for example, this sequencing is sequenced in this way, but instead, obviously, they're going to go that further to say, well, how do you know this works? How do you know this specific version of it works? What checks have you done and what data have you got to support those assumptions before? And obviously, from a micro level, that needs to be slightly more granular in terms of computing, but in terms of that kind of leadership one across the whole curriculum, then that's where you need your curriculum leaders to give you that information on a granular level so you can understand it and then talk about it. So really, I suppose there's a few more questions which Ofsted are wanting that clarity on in terms of sequencing. So the first one is, how does a school respond to high strain areas? As an Ofsted inspector, you can say, well, how do you know these are high strain areas? Where's your proof from that? It's okay to say, for example, while students have previously struggled on this, okay, so where's your data to support that? And again, I think that's where it's helpful to actually have a metric such as this, where you can mathematically say, well, actually, if you look at the spec, this is where it is high strain. There's no arguing. This is mathematically, statistically, the outcome of it. So when you've got that idea about what actually signifies and demonstrates itself as being high strain, how are those misconceptions overcome? You've identified them. What are you doing about them? So for me, that's where it might be helpful in that same spreadsheet, because it's in the same document for ease, to say, well, as a consequence of this, we've put this in this specific order. And from a more senior aspect, you can say, well, we've arranged all this, the curriculums in this order because actually it reduces as a whole year and as a whole, school, that's cognitive strain. So you can also then break it down further. So for example, you've found out, and you'll see in the spreadsheet why this perhaps makes sense. I'll talk about computing. So I know, for example, year 6 SATs, I know it's is starkly contrasting to year 3, where in year 3 it's actually the easiest of most of the years in terms of cognitive strain. But in year 6, I know that this specific module is really challenging, go for programming. So now I know that that specific module is challenging, I can then say, well, lesson by lesson, which lesson is more cognitively demanding? And I can say, well, actually, lesson 6 is more cognitively demanding. I need to focus really on making sure that I've got the retrieval and the previous lessons to support and underpin that. So this isn't something that's just, unit by unit. We've got lesson by lesson. So when Ofsted come in, they can say, how are they anticipated? I can say, well, not only is this unit harder, this lesson is harder, and therefore I've done this over the other lessons to help remedy and overcome those misconceptions and those barriers. They could also ask, how is progression monitored across the years? Well, again, I've got the same spreadsheet. It's all in that same place. I can just show them and say, well, actually, the same principle is applied through all of the years. And as a consequence, if I'm going to go on a trip, or I probably would recommend going in year 3, because actually I've got the space to do that without detracting from the curriculum. If I'm going to have fancy, days or whatever, again, year 3 is probably going to be the best year in order to do that. If I'm going to have it through in the other years, I can then say, well, actually, I've done it in this specific place. But again, it just allows me to actually show across all these year groups how that progression is actually making an impact. And more importantly, it gives you and inspectors the confidence that leaders, without a shadow of a doubt, there is no doubt, you know how to sequence your curriculum. And I suppose this slide really just highlights what I've just said in the previous slide and emphasizes it, because you can clearly empower your school leaders and your curriculum leaders to create that narrative and to have the confidence. I've been in many Ofsteds where the person will sit there and they've been asked these questions and they will hands up say, well, I don't have the answer to that. I don't know it. And I think it's an awful feeling actually being next to someone, you can see them freeze up like that. And you obviously will come and try to mitigate that freeze, but actually you can only do so much because you're not the curriculum leader. And I suppose that narrative, you want that to come out quite freely and for that to be confident. And that empowerment is something that's really, really important. And when you've got this document in front of you, it's all in that same place. You're not going to different places, it's just that one place. And actually getting the teachers to understand that, rather than having, and you can see it on school websites, this is how we sequence, and I'll tell you how, but not necessarily the why. And you'll often see it's it's created by AI, and they've got lots of lovely language, linguistic elements where it shows, wow, this looks really fancy. But when you actually speak to the teacher, they're like, A, it was AI that wrote it, I don't really understand it, and B, I just follow the sequence which is in the national curriculum. And unfortunately, and I don't know, but I would imagine, based on what I'm being told, when Ofsted come in, that probably won't be good enough anymore. And obviously, we all know you wouldn't say, "Oh, just follow the sequence" necessarily, but you would say things like, "Well, it's not been changed." So you kind of get to the same product by not saying it quite bluntly, but Ofsted aren't, daft. They're going to know you follow it because you follow it. And just by reiterating their sequencing, I don't think that's good enough anymore. I think and we're entering a new era of reflectiveness where teachers need to be a bit more understanding of statistics and a bit more, especially with the empowerment of AI. I think Ofsted's expecting this kind of approach when it comes to sequencing, where all of the facts are there and all of the data is there, and all you're doing is showcasing the journey which you've made. And without a shadow of a doubt, Ofsted can see it works, and that you're right. So to summarise, before you get to see the spreadsheet, and again, please forgive me if you think I'm waffling, I just really want you to understand what the spreadsheet does, and it's not just a spreadsheet, but it's the next step really in sequencing. So what this does do is give you that strategic clarity, which I think can empower, as a school leader, it would empower me to really understand my curriculums and therefore be more supportive. You'll go for pupil voice, for example, and they will tell you something. So, for example, they might say, well, actually, I struggle with X, Y, and Z. And you can then go and say, well, actually, this is the proof in the pudding that the students are saying they're struggling with this, and we can see why they're struggling. It's in the wrong sequence. And even in a lesson by a lesson, if they go out and say, well, I don't understand this lesson, again, we can go back and say, this is probably the reason why. And that level of analysis is something which has been missing. And as a head teacher, if I had that, I would be like, right, okay, I know how to help support my staff and to support my students more, because I know exactly where things are going right and exactly where things are going wrong. So without further ado, the next slide, you'll see this spreadsheet, and obviously you'll hear me talking about it. It goes through relatively quick, but that's because it's giving you an overview. And from what I've spoken about in the previous slides, I think you will contextually get a bit of an understanding as to what it does, so that I'm not reiterating it whilst I'm going through it with you. Don't forget, this is all accessible on the Transform SharePoint site, so download it, have a play with it, and don't forget, email me if you've got questions or thoughts. If you look at this and say, you know what, this is missing, tell me. Let's get it in there. I don't profess to know everything. I think I'm good at what I do, but you can obviously develop this with me. So play around with it, see what you think, and let me know. So what we need to do is to look at this document carefully and explore a bit of the cognitive science behind it. So let's explore a bit more about what cognitive load theory is. And the way that we can do that is by having a look at this chart. And you can see clearly here that you can filter by year group, you can filter by the order of the lessons, you'd even filter by the term. For now, let's just explore quickly all of the year groups. What we can then see is we've got the strand, we've got the unit, we've got the lesson order from 1 to 6, or however many you've got in a term, you've got the lesson objectives, and more importantly, the success criteria. You can also there see the cognitive verb, you've got the Bloom's taxonomy, and also the cognitive demand from 1 to 5. That's already pre-populated. Teachers don't have to do anything with that. It just calculates it itself. And that's the same as the load. You can then see that there's a list of misconceptions and possible suggested, ones that might come up, but obviously being a teacher, you can change this. And then you can also see on the other side that there were some ideas to have a look about solutions and how I can showcase it. On the other tab, you can see now a bit more clearly how all of that adds up. I can see the score for the average cognitive load. I can see it for the average cognitive demand, the strain index, and indeed the watch list, which basically regulates it from high all the way down to balanced. And you can see this now across the whole curriculum for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. I can then filter further and highlight solely the ones that are rated as high. And I know that these are the ones that I need to work on in order to make sure that students make this, the required progress and are able to overcome the strain. I can do that again for all of the watch lists, just to make sure that they are sequenced in the correct order. So let's just take a look now more at Year 6. And what you want to avoid is, as you can see there, the data and information in the programming B, for those two to be adjacent to each other, because that means we've not carefully sequenced it, and I can see two high modules. We need spacing. So what that enables me to do here is to go back into the main the main page, and then I can edit the sequence. I can put where they are to make sure that they're not, two highs aren't next to each other. And we've got a carefully considered sequence where watch is embedded within high to reduce that cognitive load. On the last page, you've got the sequencing and progression dashboard. Here you can see basically all the charts that show over time how our curriculum is looking. I can see the cognitive demand, the average conceptual load year by year, and that just allows me as a teacher to have that forward planning. I think what's important is to have a look at these charts in a careful and considered way. And what it should do is enable you to really know your curriculum, and even more importantly, to be able to articulate that curriculum when asked, especially obviously by Ofsted. Thank you for watching this podcast, and hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight as to the way I would approach sequencing. And as I said a bit earlier on, please let me know your comments, your thoughts, and your feedback. And who knows, maybe we can develop this and make it something really bespoke to your school, and therefore helping you to understand and be able to articulate to Ofsted just the amazing work that you do in your schools in understanding your curriculum. Thank you very much.